So I've been making videos on this channel for a really long time, almost 7 years, and I think people still get confused by my ethnicity. Because I'm a Muslim and because I have an Arabic name, I think some people assume that I'm Middle Eastern. I think also some people assume that I'm Latino or Hispanic because Trinidad is a Spanish word.
I didn't ask to be born Latina. No mas chiva suerte.
But most of the time I get confused for being black, and that's probably because I'm from the Caribbean, and I guess some people think that Caribbean automatically means black. So today I'm here to do three things. I'm going to be explaining to you what being Indo-Caribbean means. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own personal identity as an Indo-Caribbean person and how I personally make sense of it. And then I'm going to give you some book recommendations for Indo-Caribbean novels and Indo-Caribbean fiction that I think you should definitely read. So let's start off with what Indo-Caribbean actually means. So Indo-Caribbean refers to people in the Caribbean region who are of Indian or South Asian descent. The vast majority of Indo-Caribbean people are not immigrants or children of immigrants or even grandchildren of immigrants. We are descendants of immigrants who came to the region generations ago. So basically, after slavery ended in the English-speaking Caribbean, or the English colonized Caribbean in the 1830s, there was a need for a new cheap labor source to work on sugarcane plantations, because obviously the white people was going to do it themselves. So they essentially devised the system of Indian indentureship, where they brought Indians from South Asia and different parts of India, North India, Central India. Some people came from parts of where is now Pakistan and Bangladesh. So all of these people came from India between, let's say, the late 1830s, 1838 when slavery ended, to the late 19-teens and early 1920s. For Trinidad and Tobago specifically, it was 1845 to 1917. So during around that time period, almost 500,000, 400 and something thousand people came from India to the region. So the vast majority of Indo-Caribbean people are descendants of those people who came to the region specifically to work on sugarcane plantations as indentured laborers. So obviously it was a very racist and exploitative system towards the Indians. I mean, it was essentially the next best thing that the colonizers could have devised after slavery. But it wasn't quite slavery. One of the main differences is that Indian people were allowed to keep aspects of their culture and their religion, which was not a privilege afforded to black people who came as slaves prior. And that's why you see Indo-Caribbean people having more explicit cultural ties to Indianness than Afro-Caribbean people have to what we think of as Africanness. And that's why also many Indo-Caribbean people were still allowed to retain their religions. Quite a few were converted to Christianity, of course, but the vast majority remained Hindu, with a very significant minority remaining Muslim. In fact, around 10 to 15% of the laborers who came during indentureship were Muslim, with the rest being Hindu. So that's why Hinduism and Islam are, still very prominent religions in the region today, especially in countries like Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname, where both of those religions are considered the country's main religions alongside Christianity. Speaking of Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname, those are the three countries or territories that got the most amount of Indians during indentureship. Other countries like Jamaica, Barbados, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenada, they all got Indian indentured immigrants, but they didn't get nearly as much, so those countries are still majority black. Whereas Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname are considered to be countries that have essentially two majority ethnic groups, black people alongside Indian people. It's important to remember too that countries like Guyana and Belize are still part of the Anglophone Caribbean, even though they are mainland Latin American countries, because of the fact that they were colonized by England, by Britain, right? So they were subject to a lot of the same laws as other English-speaking Caribbean islands like Jamaica and Trinidad and Barbados. Suriname, even though it was not a British colony, it was a Dutch colony, it was still subjected to some of the same laws, so it's still also considered to be part of the Caribbean, even though it's not an island. So that's an important thing, just as a side note, to remember. Not every Caribbean country is an island, and not every Caribbean island is an independent country. But yeah, Indians have become a huge part of the Caribbean cultural and political and social landscape. And, especially as I said, in countries like Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname, where we make up majority groups alongside people, Indo-Caribbean people have, developed and established their communities and their cultures and their religious institutions and their family dynamics in the region to the point where, we constitute a very significant part of what it means to be Caribbean and Caribbean culture, right? And also, again, in these three specific countries, I could speak from my experience in Trinidad, being a part of a majority group, you don't really experience a lot of the same things that people of color in other countries, like, say, America would experience, or even other groups of people of color in Trinidad who are not black or Indian. You have that privilege of belonging to a space where almost half the population looks like you, and I think for me that was a really cool thing to have growing up. and I'm very grateful to be in an environment where I never had to, feel different because of who I am or how I look. So that leads me to the second part of this video, where I kind of wanted to discuss, my own personal relationship with Indian identity and how I personally identify when it comes to Indianness. It's never really something that I personally ever put much thought into growing up, because being a part of a majority group, I never was made to feel different from other people growing up. Nobody ever made me feel different or weird. I grew up on a family street where pretty much all of my neighbors are my family and everybody is Indian, so I never quite felt like an outcast or that I was different. Even in school, both of the schools that I went to, primary and secondary, were like very much equal, like split down the middle when it comes to Black students and Indian students. So I've never felt out of place. I never felt like a fish out of water in my own country, and that again is a really huge privilege to have growing up, because not everybody has that. I also never really experienced a lot of racism growing up, which I was lucky to evade. That's not to say that that doesn't happen to Indo-Caribbean people, because it does. Racism and racial issues in Trinidad and Tobago are far from over the Caribbean as a whole. But again, being a part of a majority group, I never had to feel like a minority. I never had to feel different, and fortunately I've just never been in a situation where anybody was very racist to me. The only time I ever actually experienced racism was in America. We were in Atlanta, Georgia, and we were in the Georgia Aquarium. I'm sorry, no, when I put it like that, it's like the only place I experienced racism was the fucking Georgia Aquarium. The only place I remember experiencing racism was the Georgia Aquarium. Woo! Okay, so it wasn't in the aquarium itself, it was in the parking lot. Sorry, this is not funny. Racism is not funny, okay? It's not funny. It was in the parking lot. We were going up the elevator. It's one of those, multiple level parking lots. And, we were in the elevator. My cousin wears hijab. My mom she doesn't wear hijab, but she was wearing an orni that day because it was cold. So we looked very ethnic, to say the least. And the elevator stopped on the floor before our floor, and it opened, and there was this white family, and they kind of just stopped and they looked at us, and I just didn't make anything of it. I thought they were just awkward and they didn't want to share an elevator with another family or whatnot. And then this girl, this teenage girl in the family, said something, and then the door closed. And so my cousin was like, "You didn't hear what they said?" And I was like, "What?" And he said, "They literally said, we don't want to be stuck in an elevator with a bunch of Indian hicks." And I was like, what's an Indian hick? I wasn't really offended. I just mostly found it fascinating from an anthropological perspective. So yeah, it was an interesting experience, but it just goes to show that, for me personally, I'm saying just for me, I'm not saying all Indo-Caribbean people, but for me personally, I've evaded that sort of thing. And so I think because of that, and because of the fact that I didn't really grow up around a lot of explicit Indian culture, so things that we associate very explicitly with Indianness in this country and globally, because I never really grew up around that, Indian identity and Indian culture is not something that was ever really important to me, and it was never something that I placed a huge emphasis on. And to be honest, it's still not something that I place much of a huge emphasis on. It's just kind of who I am. It's just it's my heritage, it's my history, but it's not a defining feature of my own personal identity and individuality, if that makes sense. Growing up, I also kind of had a little bit of a resentment towards it, because I always used to feel like I wasn't Indian enough in a way, because I never particularly, I never grew up watching Bollywood movies. I still don't really like to watch Bollywood movies. I've never listened to Indian music or chutney music. I don't own a single article of Indian clothing, so growing up, because I was so personally distant from it, but I have relatives and family members and friends who were very much, entrenched into all of those things, I always felt like I just wasn't Indian enough for most people, and that I don't really have that huge of a connection to Indian culture. But as I got older, and as I got a little less dumb, I started to realize that Indian culture is more than just saris and roti and Bollywood and chutney and all that kind of stuff. It's more than just the explicit, visible things that we are quick to associate with what being Indian means, but it's also about family dynamic, it's about community dynamic, it's about the values that you were raised with. So when you put it like that, then I would say I grew up in a very, Indian environment, and an environment that was heavily influenced by Islam as well. As I said, a very significant proportion of Indo-Caribbean people are Muslim. And so for me, what I started to realize is that a lot of the things that I grew up with and that I associated with just Islam was also heavily influenced by my Indian culture and heritage as well. The ways that we practice Islam in my family and in my Muslim community is very much influenced by aspects of our Indian culture. Growing up, we always had readings and functions and get-togethers in my family and stuff like that, and people would sing qasidas, which are like these Islamic songs but in Urdu. We would have things like readings and prayers for people after they died, and 40 days and 3 days and those types of things that are not necessarily like associated with global Islam, but that are connected with that sort of Indian Islam and that Indian Caribbean Islam, right? I'm not trying to say that religion and culture are the same thing. They're absolutely not. But we do have to understand that religion and culture, or religion and ethnicity, are also heavily interlaced, right? As I said, the kind of Islam that I grew up in was influenced by Indian culture, but the kind of Indian culture that I grew up in is also heavily shaped by the tenets and the beliefs of Islam. So for me, what I realized is that my experience with Indian culture is really more so about family and community and religion than it is about like other like more explicit things. And that to me is beautiful because it just shows how diverse our culture actually is, and how everybody who is raised in our types of communities can come from vastly different experiences and have vastly different relationships with what it means to be Indian or Indo-Caribbean, right? So I think that that just goes to show that there's so much about our community that we don't even like consider or think about a lot of the times. I always say too that being a part of an ethnic group, it's more of a historical thing than it is a cultural thing. I mean, culture is super important, but what defines you as Indo-Caribbean is not really your culture, but your history. You could be totally and completely whitewashed, but you're still a descendant of Indian indentured immigrants who came to the Caribbean, and that will always make you Indo-Caribbean, no matter what your cultural adherence is. So yeah, I mean, being Indo-Caribbean is not something that I ever put much thought into growing up. I do put a lot of thought into it now because of what I'm doing in school. So my master's thesis is currently focused on Indo-Caribbean Muslim masculinity. So I'm looking at the intersection of being Indian and Muslim in the Caribbean and masculinity. So essentially me, minus the masculinity, let's be honest. Okay, so I have about 12, I want to say, books here that I want to recommend. Not a comprehensive list. Don't get mad at me, but I only have 2 books set in Guyana of the 12. The rest are set in Trinidad. I'm sorry to the Guyanese. I'm sorry to the Surinamese, because I don't even have one Surinamese book in here. I'm from Trinidad, so I'm exposed. I just kind of gravitated more towards the Trinidadian literature, but I intend to fix that in the future. Okay, so the 2 books that I have that are set in Guyana are both by the same author again. Sorry, and that's Ryan Shah. Her first book is called A Silent Life, which is a really, really wonderful story about this girl whose grandmother is silent and doesn't speak. So we're following the young girl Aaliyah from her childhood to her adulthood, and her very interesting relationship with her grandmother. She becomes so curious about her grandmother's life that she eventually begins to see her grandmother's past. So like That's a Raven, but in the reverse. So she has these interesting visions that transport her to her past, where she learns more about her grandmother and why her grandmother doesn't speak, and the things that sort of traumatized her into becoming this silent woman. And it's this really interesting journey that also talks about mental health, and we actually see some of the things happening to the grandmother repeating itself, like history repeating itself in the main character's life. So it's also a story about intergenerational trauma. And it's so good. It reads like a love letter to Guyana. It's just wonderful, and the writing in here is incredible. And it follows a Muslim family, so if you want to read more like Caribbean Muslim fiction, Ryan Shah is a good choice. And this book, A Death in the Family, her other book, also deals with like Indo-Caribbean Muslim culture more in detail. This one particularly follows 3 siblings after the death of their father, and it's about them all sort of like reflecting on their very complicated relationship with him. He was a very patriarchal man, very traditional Muslim Indian guy, and because of that he had lots of expectations of his children, and each of the children either fulfilled or didn't fulfill his expectations in many different ways. So it's about them kind of trying to navigate and make sense of their complicated relationships towards this man who they really, really loved, but who was also a source of tension in their lives. If it's one Indo-Caribbean author that everybody should read, it's Shani Mutu. Okay, she has quite a few books. I think she has like 6 or 7, but I've only read 4 thus far. Her first book is actually a short story collection called Out on Main Street. So this takes place between Trinidad and Canada, but they all kind of deal with like womanhood and queerness and the intersection of queerness and Indo-Caribbeanness, and that's kind of what Shani Mutu does. I didn't love this one so much though, though, so I would suggest starting with her debut novel. This is Sirius Blooms at Night. This one takes place in a fictional Caribbean island that is inspired by Trinidad, and it's about this woman named Mala who has had a very tumultuous past, and she's kind of like, hated by the community. Also, everybody kind of looks at her as this like batshit crazy old woman. She ends up being admitted to this nursing home, and this nurse named Tyler takes sort of pity on her, and as he gets to learn about her, he begins to narrate her story, and you get to learn about her background. And it's also a really interesting exploration of the history of like Christian Indians. Remember, I said that some Indo-Caribbean people were converted to Christianity, and this book kind of focuses on the Presbyterian movement from Canada and how it came to Trinidad and how it specifically targeted members of the Indian community, and we saw the dynamics of that in this book as well. The first book I read from Shani Muthu though was Valmiki's Daughter, and this is still one of my favorite books. It's so good and so intense and so like nuanced and wonderful in its exploration of sexuality and gender identity. So both of whom are queer and in the closet, and so it's about their generational differences and how they both kind of deal with being queer as upper class Indians in South Trinidad, and the kind of expectations that they have to live up to as not just Indians but Hindus and all that kind of stuff. It's a really, really good book that delves into how queerness can shape your experience of family and community life. And then I read her most recent book, which is called Polar Vortex. This one takes place entirely in Canada, and it's following a woman from Trinidad named Priya who has been living in Canada for a really long time. Bird. Yes, ma'am. No, honey. She's been living with her wife for a really long time, and they have a good relationship with each other and whatnot, or a seemingly good relationship, until somebody from Priya's past shows up, and it kind of complicates things. And it's a really interesting book that really deconstructs sexuality and really shows how sexuality and sexual identity is so much more fluid and complex than we give it credit for, in the ways that we make sense of sexuality. Okay, so that's enough Shani Muthu. Let's get into some other authors. Obviously, I can't make a video like this without talking about V.S. Naipaul. I've only read one of his books thus far, which was Miguel Street, and I didn't like it. But people seem to love it, so I wouldn't not recommend it. It's a classic. It was published like in the 1950s, I think, and it's set closer to the time of World War II, a little bit after, a few years after World War II. I would say that this book is very much reminiscent of The House on Mango Street, or rather, since this was published first, The House on Mango Street is a reminiscent of Miguel Street. But in The House on Mango Street, you know how every chapter is just very episodic. The book doesn't have an overarching plot or narrative. Every chapter is like a new situation or short story or something going on. And the main character of this book, who's kind of like the main character in House on Mango Street, is kind of just observing everybody and is curious about everybody and is describing them in the process. So it's a really interesting sort of exploration of all of the men on this street, their identities, their relationships with each other. It's about historicizing masculinity. It's a really good novel in terms of what it has to offer thematically. I just didn't care for it. If you do like those, House on Mango Street-esque episodic types of novels though, and you don't like Miguel Street like me, a book that I think is a lot better than Miguel Street in my opinion, but has the same type of storytelling style, or is written in the same way in the sense that it's an episodic book set on a street or in a community, that's Butterfly in the Wind by Lakshmi Prasad. It's following this young woman as she's growing up in this community in Tunapuna, in this predominantly Hindu-Indian community. That's what I was supposed to say, right? And so it's kind of just about her experiences growing up in that kind of environment. And what I really appreciated about it is that it's not a story that delves too much into like trauma or abuse. This book kind of strays away from that in its exploration of community life, and it's really good. It's really, really good, and I would highly recommend that you read it. I also highly recommend The Yad by Elia Nayar. This one takes place in central Trinidad, and it follows a Indian Muslim family again, and it's set in like a family community. So they all live in this compound that they call the Yad, which is a very common living arrangement in Trinidad, like a big extended family living in one property or one compound, and everybody has their own little house or apartment or whatnot, and they just call it the Yad. And we're following this young girl in the family whose adoptive brother and who have a very complicated relationship growing up, so we're following them from childhood to adulthood. But what really resonated with me about this book was, again, the community dynamics and growing up in an extended family community, especially a Muslim extended family community. It was a really interesting representation of that, and I enjoyed this book primarily for that reason. If you want to fly back to Canada for a second, I would highly recommend that you read Brother by David Chariandi. So this one takes place entirely in Toronto, and it follows these two boys who are Dogla, so half Indian, half black. Dogla is the term that means that. But they grow up primarily identifying as black because their Indian father is not really a part of their lives. So they grew up with their Afro-Trinidadian mother in Toronto. And it's a book that actually kind of addresses police brutality. So we're following the two brothers in two different timelines, 10 years apart, right? And one of the brothers ends up kind of like leaving the family for reasons that we don't really know in the future timeline. So we're jumping back and forth to kind of piece together the story of what happened to him and why he left and all that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting exploration of that dynamic, and it talks about police brutality in Toronto and how it affects black and brown communities. You know, we often talk about police brutality in the US and then view Canada as this, you know, racial utopia, which is not the case. So it's an interesting book that delves into that kind of exploration, and I'd highly recommend that you give it a try. Then finally, I would have to recommend The Beast of Kikuyu by Kevin Darrett Hussein. This is the only young adult book on the list. This one takes place in like a fictitious village that's supposed to be set in like central Trinidad, and it's essentially a murder mystery. Our main character's friend from school dies and her body is discovered, and it ends up being about her taking it under her own wings because she's kind of frustrated with the fact that nobody really seems to care about what happened. Since it's a murder mystery, it's very like, you know, compelling, it's very thrilling. Such a talented writer, such a well-told story. Absolutely recommended. The last book I'm actually currently reading, and I know I said I wouldn't recommend books that I haven't finished on this channel anymore, or that I wouldn't talk about books that I haven't finished, but by the time you see this video I should have finished this book, hopefully, fingers crossed. But that is The Jumbie Bird by Ismath Khan, and this is another classic published in the 1960s but set a little earlier, I believe in the 20s or 30s, and it's following this young boy in an Indian Muslim community family who is very fascinated with his grandfather, a man who came to Trinidad during indentureship. So it's an interesting book that kind of explores, you know, his relationship with his grandfather and their relationship with like Indian Muslim identity, how Indians kind of assimilate and fit into the wider cultural landscape of Trinidad during that time. And it's supposed to, I guess, to talk about like the Jumbie Bird, the legend of the Jumbie Bird, which is if you see an owl or you hear it screech up at a particular point in the day, then it's like an omen for death or something. I haven't gotten to that part where the bird becomes relevant in the story as yet, so I can't really tell you like what that has to do with the book. But I'm really enjoying it so far, and it's a classic I've always wanted to read, so happy to be finally reading it. Okay, this video is already too damn long. I'm gonna have to say thank you all for tuning in and watching it and spending what was too much time with me. Hopefully you learned something, and hopefully you got some really great recommendations. So in the comments down below, I'd love to know if you have read any of these books. If you have any recommendations for Indo-Caribbean books and Indo-Caribbean literature, I'd love to hear from you. Either way, thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you have a lovely day, and until next time, inshallah, keep reading.